I just hope this is going to YouTube. And can somebody text Harry that same link? Since you got Harry's number, I think, right?
I got what?
You got Harry's number. Either way, if this records to YouTube, it'll be recorded, so people can watch it afterwards.
Slack and tag him.
Oh, sure.
Unless you only want him to have it.
No. You can put it in Slack. That's fine.
And it was youtube.com/FatBoyXPC.
Yeah.
I found it, but the internet is being a little slow, so I don't know how.
But does it show that I'm supposed to be that I'm live?
I don't see that you're live here.
Oh man.
Wait a minute. I see something. Oh wait.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Here.
It just says.
Let me change what the screen's looking at. There, you should see Vim on the screen in like 20 seconds.
Well. Okay.
Yeah, we're still seeing what you had up before.
Maybe my YouTube channel will show this. I almost forgot because I was so focused on that Xdebug thing that 2 people had asked me to stream this.
There you go. We're seeing them, but it's not full screen.
What does that mean?
It's taking up like most of the.
Oh, well that's neat.
Super. Probably because you have.
I can fix this. Check this out.
Oh, there you go.
Oh, come on, come back.
And now
There.
just wait for 20 seconds.
Yeah, there's a delay, but it's not a big deal. And then I use the little YouTube editor to cut out the first 3 minutes or whatever it ends up being.
No, just be that guy that is like too lazy to do that. And just like video starts at 3 minutes.
Oh, I've honestly thought about that. Dude, I almost started without you, and I literally said, and I said, "Where's Tarek?" And because like, you're the whole reason we're doing this talk, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So we're all good to go. Am I good to go on the?
Very smart making James do all the hard work.
Yes,
Yep.
I can see it. I don't know about the audio. Say something.
Something? Wait 20 minutes? Like, all you have to do is just put your earphones in. We've been talking this whole time.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I just heard myself saying I don't know about the audio.
Okay. All right. So getting back to where we were starting. So Tarek actually asked us if we could talk about the authorization stuff with Laravel, how to approach it, if there's anything built into the framework. The answer is, of course, it's Laravel. Why wouldn't it be? So we're going to talk about what are known as gates and policies today. And those are 2 different ways of doing authorization, which is, so the difference between authentication and authorization is like getting logged into a system to be like, be recognized as a user, which is usually like kind of like a default permission of like you're allowed to be here. And an authorization is usually a permission or role-based thing of like this user is allowed to perform some action. And there are 2 main ways of doing that. There's role-based authorization and then there's permission-based authorization. I feel like a lot of people in the Laravel community like to just have like is admin, is moderator, whatever kinds of columns on the users table. I think some people in air quotes enterprise level frameworks like using ACL lists for having like a list of permissions and a list of users with those permissions. We're going to actually look at both approaches today if we have time. I did not push everything to the database, but I have a nice little snippet of like what it would look like if you went through the database. I just did some in-memory state to make it easier for the presentation. So we'll go ahead and first show the documentation here on policies. So if you were to, I'm going to kind of skim through some of this. So remember I said there are gates and policies. Think of gates as a one-off permission defined to just do a thing. Like you define a gate, you give it a name, and you put whatever you decide is your logic for the logged in user or the user presented to the gate function. You have like logic in there. Maybe like you put user as admin, maybe you put user's account is 30 days old, that kind of thing. And think of policies, at least what the documentation says, as kind of like a CRUD style resource for a model. So you can kind of have functions in your policy that matches to like, create, read, update, delete, restore, that kind of stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and start us out here. Like here's writing gates and stuff. We're going to actually go ahead and look at back. Think about when you write your own controller, you'll have like if a user can edit a post, you usually have some sort of if logic in the controller as your first couple lines of code. And then like you'll have like your kick them out if you can't do this or continue on through the function. So we're going to look at something like that. We already have some tests set up, of course. So we have a user can edit a post test, I believe. Edit post. So here we have a user can edit their own post. We create a user. We create a post. We save it through the relationship. We go to this route. the post update route, we give it a new title and a new body, and then we refresh the post here. We want to make these assertions that, you know, the new title and body got saved. We also want to make sure we get redirected. This is a pretty basic post, and we'll go and look at the controller logic. It's pretty simple. We have our if statement that I mentioned earlier. We just update the post, request all. Let's not nitpick about using request all and fillable and stuff. Again, this is just, we want to focus on the authorization stuff. And then redirect route. So if we run this test, let's hope this passes. So our test passed up there in the corner. And then we have a user cannot edit a different user's post. So we have our user factory again. We have another user's post. This gets assigned to user when we go through the factory. We're giving it a default user ID just to clear that up here.
Wait,
Again,
where's that happening?
so you see this factory here?
Mm-hmm.
It has a default.
Oh, okay. So
we give it a
in
default
that-
user
okay,
ID.
Cool.
Yeah. That's why I named it another user's post to kind of make it a little bit more clear that it's not this user here. And if you notice, we're not saving it through the relationship like we were up here.
Mm-hmm.
Again, we edit it and we assert that we get a title and a body rather than new title and new body. We're going to go ahead and run this post as well, or this test. And again, this test passes. So I'll go ahead and make both of those tests fail. Oh, admin can edit any post. Let's go down there as well. We create an admin user. We're using factory states for admin. We can look at that later. Again, another user post response. We want to make sure that we get new title and new body with an admin being logged in here with acting as. That test passes. So now I'm going to just go ahead and run the whole test file so we can see all three tests happening. And we're just going to keep running all three tests here as we're going along the path of refactoring this code. So again, here's our controller. If the request user is the post user, or if the request user is not the post user, or I'm not an admin, we're going to return a 403 response. This is using the response helper. There are other ways to accomplish the same thing, but we'll get down there in a minute. I'm going to remove this if statement so we can see these tests fail, right? So now we have test failures. We'll undo that, rerun them again. We'll see that it works. So I think a common thing that you might refactor is just get rid of this expression, give it a name variable to make it a little bit easier. So we'll start there. We'll call this user can edit post. Now the thing about this is this is actually user can't edit post, but I don't like naming things negatively, so we're going to invert the expression, and then we'll invert it again in the if statement.
Seem to be getting around pretty slow and been there.
I'm slowing down on purpose when I was running. No, check this out. Ask Glenn. When I was running through this like an hour ago, I was like, I'm moving too quick, so I need to slow myself down because I kept making really
I usually
dumb
say
mistakes.
the same thing to the people I jog with. Slowing down on purpose. Slowing down on purpose.
Yeah. And anyway, so I took the not off of there and I put the or. So like if I am the post user or I'm an admin, I can edit the post. And I threw that not back into the if statement here. Our test should still pass. Great. I think a lot of people don't realize there's this really cool abort helper. You can give it abort 403, and this will actually create an exception. When you get 403, it creates an authorization exception, and the Laravel exception handler will just handle that and turn it into a 403 response for you. So we still get a 403 response here. Now, these 3 lines of code is actually really nice. You can condense these down into one. There's an abort if function you can write where you give it a condition and then the abort you want to throw. So we can write abort if here. And we'll put our condition, not user can add a post. And we'll do 403 here. Get rid of these guys. Rerun the tests. And it passes. So there's another thing we could, I'll back up, I'll do that one later. So does this make sense, how this little refactoring so far? Like we haven't really changed anything in terms of using gates or policies. We just found ways we can make the 3 or 4 lines of code in a weird expression, condensed it down, make it a little bit easier to read, right? So now I think what a lot of people would do from this point, if they don't want to see this in the controller everywhere, and more importantly, you're probably going to have similar logic in other places, you might want to put this into the user model. So we'll go down to something like can edit post. We'll pass a post into here. We won't type in it just to get on Minky's nerves. And we'll, let's see, return. Well, let me get that out of the way.
Okay.
I didn't type in this as a post just to get on your nerves.
Oh, okay.
This is admin.
This guy's running with scissors.
And it's nice, if we do is admin first instead of last, then we get a nice little short circuit effect of not querying the post user as well. I'll show you what I mean in a second. Or this user, or this is post user. So we can save this, we can go back to our controller, and we can update this to use the user can edit post.
Request users in that, yeah.
Thank you, Glenn. I did this earlier as well. All right, there we go. And we can go back to this. So does this make sense? We just move that to the user model, right? Can edit a post, you gave it a post. And we run the test. All right, I didn't screw anything up. Is there any reason that anybody has that you would not want to move that to user model? Any complaints? I really expected one from you.
No, but I basically, I've worked with the similar concepts of like a gate and other languages, and I like where you're going more than where you're currently at, so keep going.
Okay. A short answer for why you don't want to put can edit post on the user model is things like we have posts, we could have comments, we could have likes, we could have videos, we could have, like eventually this is going to blow up, and you'll hear people talk about God objects, and more importantly in the Laravel context or a Rails context, you'll have what's called like the user object as a God model, because you end up putting everything in the user model because users can do so many things. So when we go this route, when you have a small little presentation like this doesn't seem so bad, but when you start talking about an enterprise level application, then you end up having 100 different permission functions in there. So how can we get rid of that? At this point, we can move to a gate, and that's pretty simple. So we're going to go to our auth service provider. We're going to go into our boot function. We're going to use the gate facade. I know how everybody loves facades in the community. We're going to write or define. We'll just cut we can give this any string we want, but to make it simple, we'll call it updating a post, right? Update post. And you just need to pass a callback into it and tell it what you want it to do. The first argument is always the user. And in this case, we also want to give it a post because we need to look at the post-user relationship, right? So we'll give it a post. And then we'll just put that same logic in there, right? It's like user is admin or user is post user. And we need the semicolon there.
You don't return that?
Yes, I do.
Oh, okay.
Good catch. Glenn didn't catch that. It's all good. So, again, you just return a Boolean from here, which this seems pretty straightforward, I hope, right? We'll go back to our controller. We can get rid of this line. And now we have a cool little function called gate. Nobody caught that I didn't import that gate, by the way. So remind me to do that before I run this
My
test.
editor auto imports.
Yeah, mine does too. It does, but I broke it this weekend. Yeah.
Nice. Mine doesn't do that.
Well, you can edit. You can't edit your editor. So update post, and then we give it the post, right? And I need to import it here as well. Oop. What I do? Oh well. Allows update post. Import this, the facade, not that. Go back to our service provider, import that as well. So if we run all three of our tests, oh man, what'd I break? If not gate allows update post. So here's the cool thing, we can go to our test, and we can run this without exception handling to see where we're failing. Oh, okay. This is I planned on talking about this later. So when you're using policies, sometimes there's some composer magic that happens because gates and policies have this weird relationship. I plan on talking about the relationship later. But gates and policies have a relationship to each other. And if you use a policy, then you get rid of the policy. You have to clear out your composer cache. So a composer dump autoload will get rid of that policy remembering, if you will. So if we rerun our test, I believe we should be fine. Great. I ran the whole suite, not just those three. I should probably just run those three, I think. Yeah, okay. So get back to our post controller. So again, this is pretty simple, right? Abort if the gate does not allow, right? Update post is the name we gave the gate function. Straightforward, right?
Is this, you can talk more on gates?
Yeah, I'm not done.
Okay.
Okay. So there's a cool little thing. If we don't want to not this, they give us another function for denies. Was that? Oh, okay. So some people don't like inverting logic all the time. I mean, we all write code, so we're kind of used to seeing the bang in the front. But again, if you want this to be a little bit simpler or to read nicer, abort if gate denies update a post. That reads fairly nicely, right? We can run our tests again. Still pass. Now there's also an abort unless that I was going to mention earlier. And we can go back to allows. So unless is kind of like an inverted if statement. If you're familiar with Blade directives, there's already an at unless directive, which is just an inverted if. Ruby has unless as well as if. So if you want to still use the allows function, and you don't want to use the not symbol, you can do abort unless gate allows. And again, it's just inverted logic. It's the same thing. Straightforward, right? This is where we move to the policies, I believe. Oh, no. I give myself a little outline here to make sure. Okay, right. So the next thing we can do is there's a controller helper called this authorize. And this is kind of like doing an abort for us. We can tell it what we want it to authorize, and we can just like let it handle everything for us. So update post again, because that was the name of the gate we defined. And we give it the post. Right, this authorize. Ability is what they call it in the Laravel language. Permission name, ability, whatever we call it. And then the variable you want it to work with. And again, the test will still pass.
So they don't,
right?
do they not provide a mechanism to apply this gate to, say, every method in a controller?
You need to wait.
Okay.
That is, how many steps forward? Like 5 more things down the list here, maybe? Okay.
Would you mind going back to the update post?
Definition? Sure.
Yeah.
In the auth service provider?
Okay, right, because that's what I was thinking, because the benefit here is really the kind of the user check is being sort of abstracted away, so you don't have to be implementing it every time.
Right. You're not passing it to user. Now, in the documentation, they do show you can do gate : for user, give it a user instance, and then write the define method, or allows. Not define. Sorry, you do it for allows or denies really. It is like if you don't use the for user function, it's going to use the currently logged in user.
Which, yeah, I mean, that seems like that would be the typical.
Right. Like maybe a use case for like if you want to use a for user is if you want to show maybe a preview of what another user would see. That might be a case of it. There are some applications where you'll log in as another user, right? When you're logging in as another user, that argument for user kind of goes away. But if you were to just show previews maybe of like what a user might see, that'd probably be a good thing to have. Something I haven't brought up yet is there are also Blade directives for some of this stuff. I'll touch on those real shortly. Are there any questions so far? I'm kind of moving fast, but I feel like it's...
Was that authorized method? I'm guessing that comes from the authenticatable trait or something?
It's in the controller. It's in the default controller. And there's a authorizable trait in the default controller. So if we look at controller, there's this authorizes a request trait here. And that's where authorizes stored at. And you can see the function here. It's using the gate. It's pulling the gate class out of the container, calling the authorize function. This goes into a pretty deep rabbit hole, so we won't keep going.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. Any other questions before I move on? All right. Okay, so this is how a basic usage of a gate, and I talked about policies later, right? So policies are meant to be as a CRUD style class that maps to your models. So now we're going to go over here and we're going to artisan make, and then policy, and we're going to give it post policy. This is kind of running out of room. And then we're going to do -m for the model name, and we can give it the post model. This is the magic I wanted you to watch. Check this out, Robert. So this command is, again, the artisan make generators are pretty straightforward, right? You can read the help text on them with the --help option if you need to.
Okay.
I'm going to hit enter in this terminal, and it opens up for me. Yours doesn't do that. What's up? Where's your editor at now, Robert?
Huh? It's on my computer still.
So in a policy, I hate this stupid space up here. They need to fix that in their stub. So policies, you can see you have view any view. There's create, update, delete, restore, right? So again, these are your very CRUD style functions. And we were doing update. So I'm going to go down here in this update function, and I'm going to put the same logic that's in the gate in here. Right, same logic. again, a user and a post, we return it. We only have to return a Boolean from here. I'm going to bring this up now so that if I forget to mention it, somebody can roll me back around to this. There is a small gotcha about returning null from these functions and returning Booleans. Remember how I said gates and policies are kind of aware of each other? We're going to get later in this talk about how a gate and policy kind of fall back on each other in a way of trying to do the right thing for you, so there's less code that you have to write. And in some of those cases, if you return a Boolean from one of these functions, some of those other hooks don't fire because of Booleans returned from these. So sometimes you want to return a null, sometimes you don't. So we'll get back to that because I don't think it's appropriate yet. But so in our update function, we have the same logic we had in the gate. Just to make things a little bit clearer, I'm going to comment this out in the gate so that way we know things are working appropriately. And then after you create a policy, you're supposed to register it in this protected policies variable. Bill, if you know about what I'm going to go to next, wait.
Wasn't gonna say anything.
Okay. So we just give it our model. Like you could use the app model string, but I like using the actual reference here because when you do find references with your editor, this will pick this up, whereas if you use the string, it won't. Post policy, learn to type, class. So we'll import this. What was that?
Did you say learn to type?
Yeah, I typed P big O instead of a big P.
Nice. You should learn to type.
I am. I'll get better someday. I'll be as good as you when I grow up.
Yeah, right.
So we register.
Just kidding. I'm pretty bad too.
Ouch. So when I learn the big O notation of my talks, I think I'll have made it. So
Nice.
we register our policy, and again, the policy is kind of married to the model. That's kind of like the whole idea behind the policies. Then we're going to go back to our post controller, and we're going to go back to our abort if, and then we can have our user, request user, learn to type again, can, and now we want to give it the name of an ability, because there are can and can't helpers now on the user model, which is kind of nice. So now we can say that we want to update because that's the action and that policy that we're looking after. And again, you pass it this post variable. And then we'll go back to passing 403. If I did everything right.
You're doing abort if can.
You're right. Let's try that $sign. All right, and we're now passing the functions. Now, again, we had to invert that logic, but if you remember, I did just say we have a can't. So we can add a T there. We got rid of that exclamation mark, and our test should still pass.
Where are those methods coming from?
So the user model has a can method defined. Now, it's not the actual user model. There's like an authorizable trait on the user model that goes down the train. Okay, you will not see the definition. I can show you the definition if you want, but it's down a rabbit hole.
Sure.
But just know that the can and can't and cannot methods, which if you don't like typing the word can't, you can also type cannot. Okay, they thought of everything, right?
Yeah.
So you have this cannot method that also runs the same way.
Cool.
Now again, you could change this to abort unless user can if you like using unless instead of if. But again, you have all sorts of ways you can call this, but this can will look at the policies, and here's the kicker, it also looks at the gates. Remember I said how policies fall back on the gates. So we could have done the same thing with user can and then passed it the update post string. Now just to prove that I'm actually going through a policy here and there's not some other magic happening, I'm going to go to our post policy and comment out our return true or whatever that was. So I'm going to comment out this line and rerun our tests. And they should fail. Did that not run? There we go. Yeah, so you have a lot of test failures now, right? So I'll uncomment that out, rerun the tests, and they pass. Everything's straightforward here. Policies are pretty straightforward, right? Makes sense for everybody? Okay.
There's a maker out of the box for policies, right?
Yeah, if you look right here. Artisan make policy, post policy. And the cool thing is if you get -m and then the name of the model,
Then
it will, all of the functions in there are usually prefixed or type hinted with model. But if you tell it which model, it'll type in with that specific model, right?
Awesome.
So we have this abort if. Now remember how I said like the can will try to go after policy and then it'll fall back to a gate? That authorize method, if you remember, we had authorize and it looked at a gate function, right? So the cool thing is we have this authorize and again we can give it update and post just like we had in that abort if with can, and again we'll still work here. Make sense?
So,
Now, I mentioned something to Bill earlier about not talking about this particular line up here. If you're particularly well versed in Laravel, which is why I think Bill might have known this, he's a pretty big Laravel fan. With Laravel 5.7, maybe 6.
Sounds right.
There's something called policy auto discovery. Actually, it was 5.8 because they added a cool function I'll get to in a minute. Policies are now auto discoverable. So you don't really have to put this here as long as you follow the Laravel naming conventions for your models and your policies. So we'll get rid of that line and we'll rerun our tests. Everything still passes.
Did you go over the naming convention?
Just the default Laravel model naming convention and policy convention, which the policy convention is model name policy.
Okay.
Right? That's all that you have to do to make auto discovery work. Now's probably the right time to talk about this. We can go to guess model names using. So with the auto discovery, you can read about this part in the docs, but I want to talk about this paragraph right here, where if you say you put your models in like the models directory, that's not Laravel convention anymore. If you do any sort of weird thing with model names or policy names, there's this function here that says like, here's how you can resolve a policy name to a model name. So if you want to kind of go against the grain of the framework a little bit, you can throw this little line in that boot function in your auth service provider, like where we defined our gate. You could put your guest names using right here, and then that would be the logic to go figure out the model names to policy names if you wanted to go against the grain. I typically like putting my models inside of a models directory. So now Robert asked earlier about authorizing multiple functions at once. Let's go back to our post controller. So this one line of code, this is only one line of code. This isn't terrible. Anytime I can reduce something to one line of code, I'm happy. But anytime I can reduce it to 0 lines of code or like a fragment of a line of code, I'm even happier. So we can get rid of this line here. And we can go up to our controller, but we don't have a constructor. We don't have a constructor yet because with most controllers, you don't need them. So we can go ahead and define one. And something you can do in Laravel constructors is if you don't want to put the middleware on a route, you could put the middleware in here, for example, right? But instead, you could do this authorized resource in here. And then give it our post class. Give that a little bit of space. Now notice how my test failed, right? If we look at which test failed, a user can add a post of their own. It's going to be the same with creating a post as well. We actually have to go to our post policy because we're authorizing an entire resource now and we're inside of a resource controller, so to speak. So it's kind of doing the logic of figuring out the controller method name that you're in and like the action you want to perform in the policy. So we need to go back to the policy and go to our view and our create and give those a positive return as well, because normally you'd actually want to put real logic in here, but for the name of the talk, or for the purposes of the talk, we're going to put true in here. Learn to type. And I still failed. So let's go to admin can edit post. Oh, I'm just bad at typing. All right, and then we go back to running our whole file. Oh. Turn that off. And our whole file. Okay, there's all three tests. And I'll go back up to our policy and I'll comment these out again. Those should have failed. Right, Glenn?
Yeah.
Oh, wait, no. I have to run the whole suite. Not the file, the whole suite. There we go. So now we have a user can create a post failed. But if we now return true for this and rerun the whole suite, we'll get another failure. And that's this HTML. This action is unauthorized, you can see here. Again, so we got to go back to our view a thing. And now we can run our whole test suite and everything passes again. Make sense? So if you're authorizing a resource, make sure that all of the other used functions in your controller have authorizations built into the policy. Otherwise, you'll start getting weird permissions issues. Not really weird. They make sense. It's just that you're going to be unexpected because you weren't thinking about it when you go authorize a resource. But that's the authorized resource thing you're asking about, right?
Yep. Can you, I'm sorry, I was looking at something on my computer. Can you go back to, okay, so you just in the constructor.
Yeah.
Got it.
You could also do something like, and a constructor, right?
So-
And any middleware like auth or foo. And like
So now,
this will enable it for all of the functions in the controller.
now let's say I have a
middleware.
controller with 10 methods and 9 of them need to be authorized, but there's one where it's like, oh, for this particular case, for whatever reason, I don't want to.
So authorized resource only authorizes resource actions.
Okay.
So there are 7 functions in a resource controller, which are going to be like your show one post, show all posts, show the edit form for a post, the post route.
I
right?
get where you're
Yeah.
I think I misunderstood.
If you're wanting to authorize everything in a controller with a particular thing, I don't know if I actually looked at how to do that in the docs. I didn't expect that question to be asked. But there is a way we can dynamically look at permissions with users later that we're going to get into.
Okay, great.
Auto discovery resource. Okay, so there's another way you can authorize routes. Instead of putting the authorized function in the controller name, or instead of putting it in the constructor, you can also put it on a route definition. So to show that, I'm going to go ahead and create a whole new route with a new model and a new factory, so we can work with that. That way our post stuff stays the same and doesn't break, because I have tests written for this post stuff, right? We're going to test drive this out. Authorize via middleware test. And then, so let's just see. Let's get our foo route. Give it a, I have too many parentheses in here. Yeah, we'll get our foo route. We'll pass it a foo object. Now I'm just kind of like making this up, right? Because it's, test driving it. And we want to make sure we get a 403 here. And unexpected.
Don't you need a foo object in scope?
I do. I was trying to figure out why I had a syntax error on that other one. So we're going to do foo equals factory, foo class, create. This will be our foo object here. And we don't really have a foo object yet. Like, we don't have a foo model, we don't have a foo factory, we don't have a foo migration. So this is kind of like the way I would, TDD out something. I'd write a test first and let it tell me everything I need to do. I'm not going to run it on every single step because that'll waste a few extra minutes. But we'll save this test. We'll run this test to show that it fails. And we're going to go ahead and create a model and a factory. -fm for factory and migration. You can see all the model options if you do -- help here. And we'll call this foo. So I'm just going to leave the default factory. We don't really care what stuff goes in there. We're just going to put stuff in there, right? Because we're only wanting to show the middleware thing. So we're just going to leave the migration alone, the factory alone, the model alone. And we should get a, oh, I didn't pull this in. Okay, rerun this. We should get a 404 now, I feel like. Oh, we didn't run the migration. I got to refresh database here. Now we should get a 404 here. Right, route not defined. So let's go back to our routes web. We'll define a foo route. Actually, we need to make this, give it our little thing. CB. We're not doing this in a controller just to make this a little bit easier, and we'll just return our foo model. That'll actually be a JSON serialized foo model. We need to give it a name for foo. And we're going to middleware. Now this is actually getting to our policy middleware part. So you can have a can keyword here. And then this is for middleware parameters when you separate it with a colon. So we're going to give it view, as in like that's the view permission we want to be able to do. And then we're going to give it, this is the most dynamic, magical stuff that Robert's going to hate. And foo is the name of the variable in our route definition. And it also has to match the name, though. This would go to the controller normally, but it also works in the callback. So foo, foo, and foo all have to match here in order for this magic to work. Okay?
What kind of errors do you get if you spelled foo like F-O-O-O?
Let's make it work, and then let's not remember to try it.
Also, can you
Probably
went
route not
pretty
found.
fast through all the foo stuff? Can you?
All I did was make a migration to factory and leave it default.
Okay, so you have a migration. So we have a new table we're working with, which has a new model,
Yeah.
and
The factory is just for like faker data,
Okay.
right? To make the factories are for test and seeds.
Got it. Okay.
Make
I'm-
sense?
I'm with you.
I intentionally flew through that because it doesn't really matter. I left it all default stuff because
Yeah.
all we need is a record.
I just wanted the
Yeah.
meta model. We have a database table. It's getting seeded.
Yeah. Okay. And it's getting seeded specifically in our. Let me save that. It's getting seeded specifically in our test here by creating it here, right? And then we're just going to send a GET request to the. That's our little route helper that says go to the foo route, which is the route name, and the foo variable, which is this thing. This knows to just extract the primary key, pass it into the URL string for us, and we want to make sure we get a 403 here. So we're going to run that test again, and we're getting a 500. So let's. I probably just have a syntax error somewhere. Let's turn off exception handling and see what I did wrong. Oh, foo does not exist.
Not importing it.
Well, I am. Oh, I bet I know where I'm not importing it from. The route web.
I didn't see any
Yeah.
link there.
You did. Up here.
Oh, just kidding. Yeah, I did.
So let's rerun that.
Testing it.
And now what am I getting? Authorization exception, hopefully. Yeah. Okay. So if we take this exception handling back out, that'll turn that into a 403 response for us, which should pass this test. Great. So for those of you who didn't understand what happened with that exception now turning green by deleting a line in a test, Laravel handles all of these validation exceptions and model not found exceptions, all of these types of things. There's an exception handler that kind of runs at the very start of the framework, and anything that gets thrown, it catches and tries to turn into a valid response for you. So a model not found exception gets turned into a 404. A validation exception gets turned into a 422. In this case, an authorization exception gets turned into a 403, so on and so forth. So if you were to put that without exception handling up here, you're going to see that exception in your test, even though the actual web server, when you look at it in your browser, will render a completely different thing.
In terms of best practices, are you supposed to kind of like leverage that, or is that like a
Leverage the exception handler?
well, turning it into a response? Yeah.
So I want to say Laravel 5.5 added response functions on the exception class. So that way, if you want the exception handler to turn it into a response, it can then do that through that function. Before then, you actually had to modify your exception handler in your application, which meant some people did some really weird stuff. I'm not a big fan of modifying that if you're in a 5.5 or higher application, because you can put it right on your custom exception that you're throwing anyway. Like the exception handler understands all of the built-in Laravel exceptions, so let it handle those like it would. And then if you have your own custom exceptions, you're in a Laravel app. I understand if you're building a library that you meant for anybody to use, whether you're in a framework or not, you might not want to do that. But if you're building your own application inside the Laravel framework, I would say just leverage the tooling Laravel gives you, so you're not modifying the default exception handler anyway. Go ahead.
I've found in the past you may have a legitimate reason to modify the exception handler.
Mhm.
For example, you may have a legitimate reason to do that if, for
Like
example,
Sentry or Bugsnag, right?
Well,
New
yeah,
Relic,
okay,
yeah.
so that's one thing, and if maybe if you're less put together than having one of those services installed, then you may just want to email specific exceptions to people and things like that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
But doing that is way different than doing it for one custom exception.
Well, yes.
That catches every exception still.
That is extravagant. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the other. So I'm not as familiar with Laravel as some of you guys, but one of the other things you want is to have good messaging back to users. And I know sometimes, right, like you have a custom exception, you throw it, you can control the message, but if you're just catching a built-in Laravel exception, I mean, it's not necessarily always what you want to display to a user. For example, we 403 on a post failing, we might want to say like, hey, you're not signed in, click here to
Right.
log in again or something like
So
that.
the cool thing with like Laravel, like with validation exceptions being turned into responses or the authorization exception, you can catch these exceptions and rethrow your own kind of exception if you want. So if you're in, let's take GitHub for example, they 404 links like a private repo that you don't have access to. Instead of telling you don't have access to it, they tell you it doesn't exist. Kind of breaks the idea of REST, but in terms of like it's obscurity, not security, but it's an added kind of a layer, right?
Yeah. You don't know whether or not it exists.
Right. And if they tell you it doesn't, maybe you'll give up.
Yeah.
Maybe you won't. But so one of those cases, if you're in a particular control of your application and you actually want to catch an authorization exception, you could catch that exception and rethrow a different one that you still have like, here's how to handle this one exception defined on that exception that extends the Laravel exception class, which is, again, nicer than modifying the default exception handler to have like some sort of really long case statement, like case exception instance of foo exception, bar exception, like you're just having a whole bunch of cases. When you have like an exception with like 30 cases defined, it gets kind of cumbersome. One or two isn't so bad, but again, anything in a small quantity is not too hard to work with, right? Are we good to move on and write another test to make this 200 instead of 403? Any questions? Cool. So let's write another test. Test can 200 from where? There's probably a better name I could write for that, but we'll get to that later. So, how do I want to, okay. So we also don't have a foo policy yet, which is kind of funny. So this is 403 for a user thing we didn't realize, or I didn't bring up. We actually don't have a policy or a gate for viewing a foo model, right? So that's why it's actually, because we don't have that defined anywhere. So I could probably actually make this test fail if I just added this as a gate.
So by default, a model will.
If you go looking for permission check and that permission doesn't even exist,
Okay.
you get a 403, right?
I
So
like that.
let's go to our auth service provider and let's just add. Remember that the authorize function and the can and can't and all that stuff, it'll look at policies and fall back down to gates. So let's write a gate. Let's just reuse this one. And let's just call this view. And then that's called post, just for making this not so confusing, I'll call it a foo. And we'll return true here. That way this doesn't run. Because foo doesn't have the relationship set up and I don't want it to hit that. So now I actually expect this test to fail because it wants a 403 instead of a 200. What did I do wrong? Can view foo. Oh, let's do this. Try again. Glenn, help me out here.
Do you have a user in that first one?
You're right. That's actually the point I was trying to make with this next function. Okay. Thank you, Glenn. So again, we're failing. If you don't have a logged in user when you're trying to access a gate or a policy, again, you still get by default a 403. This is a point that I was literally going to make here.
So creating a user inside a test will automatically log it in?
When you give it acting
Yeah,
as,
acting
yeah.
as, I got it. Got it.
So now I expect to get a 200 here, which should fail this test. Well, try this again. Great. It expected 403. Receive 200, right? So if we go back to our gate, and we change this to just return nothing, it'll default out, right? So we'll go to our middleware test. Go down here, create a user as well. Actually, I don't feel like I need to. That made sense, right? I don't need to write another test to prove it because I just did the 200 and the 403. Everybody good on that?
So you're saying we don't need to write tests?
No. Boxing glove emoji times 10. Wow. Okay. Okay, Robert.
Yeah, exactly.
Touche. That stung a little bit.
Well, to quote Linus Torvalds, not many people write, or what was this quote? Not many people write perfect code except for me, and you're not me, or something like that.
Oh yeah. I mean, he also has no problem flipping off NVIDIA on camera with them there.
I know.
Whatever. I'm not nearly as arrogant as him. I might be arrogant, but not that crazy.
Sounds pretty arrogant to dismiss your arrogance as being less arrogant than his arrogance.
That doesn't work that way. That does not work that way. That's just self-actualization. Right? So, we'll run this test, and we expected 200, but we got a 403. Are we returning false there? Yeah. So, in this case, we want a way to make both tests work, so I'm just going to go ahead and only look for an admin here. Right, and that should make that test pass. We get a 200. And if we run the whole file, both tests should now pass. We'll look at our tests again. Here we just have a regular user. Here we have an admin using the states again. Do both of these make sense to everybody? Now I have my test so Robert can't go after me for that. So that's actually using a gate middleware. I jumped the gun. Now we're going to go and use policy middleware. So I'm going to modify these tests instead of, because we're not going to be using that gate anymore. So let's get rid of this gate. And now we should get 2 failures here, or 1 failure because one was still 403. And we'll go back to here, to our else web. We're going to leave this alone. We're going to leave can view foo alone. And we're going to just create a foo policy. Give it the foo model again. We'll go to our view key here. Turn user is admin. And we'll see, did I do enough here? Yeah. So does that make sense? It defaults to a gate, or like it defaults to a policy. If you can't find a policy, it goes down to the gate. We deleted the gate just to prove that that policy is in effect. I'll comment this line out and we should get 1 failure here. Right? So the middleware is pretty simple. Can, colon, view, and then foo. And everything works as expected. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Now we're at a point to where we want to, this is kind of if you want to write a lot of code. Say you have 10 models, you're writing 10 policies. That kind of gets cumbersome, right? So what if we wanted to drive some of this with a database? Let's go to our auth service provider again. And I'll leave this here so we can see it still, but there are 2 hooks that gates provide. And there is a before, which you can call before, and this will happen before any gate check happens. I'm going to repeat and sound like a broken record. Policies fall back to gates. So this will happen before any policy check happens as well.
Wait,
right?
what? Hold on.
We're going to define this before function.
You said it happens before any gate check.
Yes.
But policies happen before gates. And then you said, but it also happens before policies.
Okay. Oh, man. Technically, gates look at policies. But the can function, oh, man. If we were to look at the code, there is no policy checking happening. Everything goes through the gate. But the gate looks for a policy, and if the policy doesn't exist, it falls back to defined gate abilities. How's that?
And gate before happens before the policies would have kicked in.
So there is no policy facade. There's only a gate facade. Like in terms of like actual code, right? There's only the gate. It's like some sort of access manager, whatever you want to call it. When you call like the can helper, it actually grabs the gate from the container, and then when it goes to like authorize an action, it says, does a policy for this model exist, yes or no? And if that answer is no, it then looks to see if the ability, like the string, like update post or update view, whatever, will say, oh, is that defined anywhere in the defined gate actions? So the gate looks for policies. If the policy is not registered or it can't be found, it then looks at the list of gate defined abilities.
And when does this happen?
This happen? Well, this is a gate. And remember, there's no policy handler. Policies are called by gates. So this will happen before all of that I just said. Make sense? You look unhappy.
No, I'm pretending to get it.
No. Let's not pretend. You of all people, One World Schoolhouse.
No, I know. I mean, I get it, kind of. Gate, like the event handler for gate that says before is going to run before policies, and then policies are going to run, and then gates are going to run, but the actual inner working is a little more complicated.
Yeah. There's like the user can function, the authorize function, and the controller helper, authorize resource, the can blade directive. Actually, I didn't mention that yet. Whoops. All of these, like the can middleware, all of them will look at the user's ability to be able to do this. They all go to user can in some way or another. And then can goes to the gate object in the container. And then gate says, okay, here's the thing that it wants. Like in this case, it'll be view. It says, do I have a policy for the variable that it gave me? And it checks to see if that variable is a model. If that variable is a model, it'll say, okay, is there a policy for this model registered? Or is it discoverable? If that answer is no, then it looks for a string view and the defined gate abilities that we used here. So if we have these defined, it will find it. But say we just put like Minky as our permission that we want in a controller, well, since this says view and not Minky, it won't find that either.
Yeah.
So
I guess another thing that's so I feel like I'm understanding the flow reasonably well, but I guess what's not still perfectly clear is why would you be coding in a fallback to a policy in the first place? I mean, why
So,
would you just be like, here is
cool.
my authorization logic?
So the documentation, the example they gave for when you might use a policy and when you might use a gate
Yeah.
is anything where you have CRUD type logic
Yeah.
or desire, you can put in a policy and everything just kind of maps one-to-one for you.
Mhm.
Like it just like looks at the model instance to figure out what type of model it is, and then it will look to see if that string is defined in the policy.
Right.
You actually do not have to follow the policy naming convention. You can have like other policy names in there. So when you like this authorize string foo, it'll look for that same foo function in the policy object.
Mhm.
So how did I get here? Oh, why would you do this? Okay. So when you define like a custom function in a policy, that only works if you have like a model where you want to do that type of thing. But if you're wanting to get away from the CRUD style stuff, and you might want to put something in a gate that's not really CRUD style, maybe you would do something like an edit settings page, which is what the docs have. So if like you want like an admin to be able to like go to some like application wide settings page, you only want admins to be able to do it. But what model would that live on?
Okay.
I guess it could be the user model, but you're not editing a user. You're editing like your application settings. So that might be a gate that you
is
define.
it fair to say policies are very tightly coupled to a particular model, whereas gates can be applied more generally to
Yes.
other concepts?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know if tightly coupled is the right word, but
Not-
bound
not-
to.
not- yeah, well,
yeah.
tightly coupled has a connotation, so I probably shouldn't have used
Yeah,
that. But
that's why I was nitpicking.
But
yeah.
yeah, basically, it's,
They're meant to be used in conjunction with models.
Yeah, like they're meant to have the mapping.
Yes.
They're mapped to not.
If you remember up here, we had the model to policy mapping, right?
Right. Correct.
So we don't need it because if you follow the convention, they're auto-discoverable. But yeah, policies are meant to be used in conjunction with models.
Okay. I feel like I understand it better now. So
Okay.
Yeah. Nice.
So when a gate check happens, when you're looking at can, can't, authorize, etc., it ends up going to the gate, checking to see if a policy exists. If it doesn't see a policy, it then goes to your defined gate actions like this, although it's commented out. So now we're going to write our before handler. Are we good to continue? Cool. So before, I'm doing this one off memory here. Let's see if I get this right. So we have a user, ability, and arguments. So we could just return true here. And some of our functions would pass at this point, some wouldn't, right? Because we want some of our actions to 200 and some of them to 403. So if you return a Boolean from the before, just like I mentioned with the policies, if you return a Boolean, this will override any check that happens afterwards. So if I return true here, you just get, yeah, you're authorized to do this. If I return false here, no, you're not authorized to do this. This will skip the rest of the policy checks and will skip all other hooks. So if you only want this to return true under certain conditions, you can't return an expression because that will always return a Boolean. You actually have to wrap this in an if statement and then return true under the condition of the if statement. Does that make sense? Go ahead, Bill.
No.
Okay.
That makes sense. Why wouldn't you be able to return the expression?
So if this returns a Boolean, right? You follow that?
Yeah,
If it returns a Boolean,
Yeah.
it will skip every other check that happens.
Oh, yes.
That
yes,
includes
yes.
the after hook, but that also includes this check or any policy check.
So if you want it to just allow some things but not others, then you want it to return null if you want to pass on to the next.
Right.
Yeah.
Like a case you might use this would be like, would put this admin check up here. Like I want to be able to do anything I can if I'm an
I was
admin,
just gonna say that. Yeah.
and that'd be great to put in the before. And we're actually going to do that in a minute.
Right. So
Right.
so like if user is admin, return true, else
Right.
return null, or yeah.
You don't have to else return null. It'll
Well,
just
yeah,
return
I guess
if you don't return, it returns null, right? But if you were to do return user is admin, that might be false.
Yeah. And that-
Then it would skip that. So in the case of like, well, I want the user to be able to edit their own post, it'll never make it that far into the policy, right? So
Sorry to interrupt, but
no, that's fine.
for hosting, and 90% of this is over my head, but I catch a little bit of it. The one thing maybe to contribute on this is I've seen kind of as we've scaled more and more permissions on who can do what get written into code, and then to the point where we finally had
Mhm.
that defines permissions a certain way. Could that be incorporated into
Yeah,
into
so-
what you're doing now, so it could be more easily portable to an enterprise
Right.
thing versus
Unfortunately, you're leaving. If I were to have made it far enough for you, we're going to get to a point to where we're going to look at a list of permissions a user has and check to see if a certain string is inside that list, just like a simple, like if it's in a list check, right? We can do that here and not have to write any policies. That's where I'm driving this toward. And so if you actually had a
you would
JSON
have
file,
that basically database-driven permission list, and you
Mhm.
just check if they have the permission.
right, just check if it's
Yeah.
if one string is inside a list of strings.
And I think to Chris's point, as far as exporting it, that would probably be somewhat custom to the particular identity management system,
Mhm.
I would imagine.
But the good news is you could write your own like handler, like people call them service classes. I don't like to call it that. Like, I don't know what's you said Okta.
Yeah, I think that's a
Is it?
popular one.
Do they give you a JSON file, or do you actually have to call out to an API?
I don't know exactly how it works, just that, if I wanted to hire, if we did incorporate that
Mhm.
and we use, Salesforce, Google, Slack, all the various services,
Right.
they've got basically like, hey, one-click button, I can add Robert as an employee, and I can add, Joe as a
For sure.
admin.
Yeah.
Just thinking to, if you're writing Laravel code and figuring out, hey, how can we incorporate what we're writing here into these enterprise things,
Mhm.
the more easily they can plug and play to some of those.
Yeah,
just kind of
it's
a,
pretty simple.
you know.
And since this happens before all of your other checks happen, this will end up being is like, is this permission in the database for this user? And in this database really could mean if I'm calling out to the Salesforce API, or if I'm looking at a JSON file on my server, or anything where like you can get a truthy response, you can put in here. I would not recommend always going to an API because this happens at the framework boot up. So as soon as a request happens, you're getting an API hit immediately. I would probably do something a little bit different, some way of caching it, whether it's a JSON file or just something to where you're not hitting the API every single request that happens, because you may not need to. And if, like artisan commands, that will fire. So if you have like a queue worker box that does stuff behind the scenes, this will fire for every one of those.
So you're saying that Laravel's kind of database-driven approach, as you scale in complexity, kind of maps well to, hey, now we're using a lot of services.
I actually haven't seen anybody use a database-driven approach,
Okay.
custom like I'm suggesting here. I've only seen
Okay.
people use Cartalist, Bike Lock, and a few others.
I don't know those services.
Yeah, they're just things.
Okay.
Some of them were made specifically for Laravel. Some of them were
Okay.
overall things with Laravel drivers.
Well, big thank you to Chris for those of you
Yeah,
who didn't
thank
know.
you.
Chris is the founder of Polio, and I told him tonight was going to be a good talk, so he, hung on.
I absorbed this much, but I'm glad you're all.
If if you remind me, Robert, I'll actually show you how we could like look at a JSON file or something.
I'd like to absorb just enough to ask some tough questions tomorrow.
That's right, you're tomorrow's trivia.
Yeah, right.
What was the first error that James encountered at the meetup? Okay, so again, we can just return back to
Meetup not found exception.
ooh attendance exception,
Bad joke.
attendance too low exception.
Yeah.
So if we return a Boolean, we'll skip all the other checks, which in a truth response, that's totally fine, but in a falsy response, that's actually bad because we might have other checks that happen later. So I'll leave this here, and we'll see that most of our tests will pass, and the other ones that we want to be 403, they won't pass. Right? So we have two failures. In this case, this is, he expected 403, but we received a 200, and that's because we returned true from here. So we have this like user is admin check in all of the other places. So what if we could we could just put that here. And it's kind of redundant because our policies still have that check, but we'll get rid of that in a minute. And now if we run our test suite, everything should be fine again. Right? Makes sense? Now to prove this works, let's go to our post policy and get rid of that is admin check. Oh, that's our post controller, not policy. Oop. Yeah. Okay, so now we have update user is the post user. We took away the admin check. And everything still passes. So this makes sense, right? Okay. Now the bigger problem here is what we didn't actually do is we didn't hide this behind an if statement. We'll make this matter more later. Are you wanting to get out of here?
Nope. I was just pulling on my other computer.
Yeah, so before and after. So remember how I said that if we return a response from here, the other functions don't fire? We can prove this with looking at our post policy and then just die dump anything from here, right? We'll never see this ASDF happen. Actually, we will. I lied, because we have some of them. Remind me to do that later. 'Cause we have some cases where the user is not an admin. Okay, so
Well, wait, but
I don't understand that.
we'll get.
yeah, because you're still returning false, right? So didn't you say that would?
Well,
be the
sometimes
value?
this is null, not false. So why don't we do this?
So that value is going to be null. Oh.
Yeah,
okay.
like if you don't put it on the database, right? So we'll do this,
Yeah.
and now we'll get some test failures.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I see.
So now we can hide this behind an if statement, right? And we can,
Wait, when do you have to cast that before bolt to make it work?
huh?
Because user could be null.
Yeah. So not user. The is admin column could be null, right?
Right.
So we can move this.
So if it's null, then it casts it to a bool, and then when it's casted to a bool, it returns false.
We actually don't need bull here anymore.
Got it.
So now all of our tests should pass again, right? And now we've seen that Boolean check, right? Okay. So the next step, we wanted to look at this to go towards the data, like a direction of a database. We can also do this here with after. You can kind of do the same thing. There's an extra confusing part about this with that null thing. Your policies and your defined gates also have to return null if you want after to be looked at.
Wait, what?
Okay.
So it's
You actually stepped out at a weird part.
That's funny.
I forgot to cast. Hang on. Let's just redo that.
Sorry, guys.
It's okay.
We're gonna be here until midnight. Nobody's allowed to leave.
We just pulled the using reminder
Okay. So we had this, and all of our tests still passed.
Yep.
Remember, I said like you need to if you return a Boolean,
Yeah.
you'll skip some other checks. I proved that, but kind of incorrectly by
So
doing something
null
like
to
this.
declare null just means didn't run.
Kind of.
Okay.
Like no decision.
Yeah.
Right.
No
Like,
decision.
Keep going.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we can see that this happens when it really shouldn't happen, right? So if we rerun our test, we'll actually see this happen one time before it dies.
Yeah.
We can go back to our service provider, but if we force this to a Boolean, we'll see that never happens now, but we get test failures, right?
Yep.
But now we don't have that happening anymore because we're forcing that policy to get skipped. And the reason that's getting skipped is because this admin is null coming from the database.
Got it.
So what's the use case for gate after?
Glenn and I had this discussion. I think the only real good reason I would use after is specifically to write a little bit tiny cleaner code. Because right now you have to write if is admin. Say I had a moderator, I have to be like another if is moderator return true, if is some other role return so on and so forth. With after, you can actually return an expression, which could be good, could be bad. Like if you have like return A or B, then that's fine. But if you have return A or B or C or D or E or F, then maybe it's better to have a bunch of statements.
But then you also have to worry about returning null.
Now with after, you don't.
Well, but in
'Cause
the
it runs at the end,
other
remember?
stuff.
Exactly. Yes.
So
So
it seems like I feel like you're.
yeah, in one way or the other, you're wrapping stuff in if statements. It's either going to be in the before or everywhere in the policies. I would rather do it in the fewest places possible. In that case, it'd be this before function. So what about moving stuff to the database? I mentioned maybe we could have a list of permissions and we could check to see if that's in an array, right?
Yeah.
Normally you might see this like, we'll go up to the user. Let's just pretend that maybe you have a, we'll go up here to keep the relationships together. Maybe you have a permissions relationship. And by the way, this is admin check is a really lazy way of doing role-based auth. I don't think we need to cover that anymore. That is admin can come from the database somehow, whether it's on the user table. Maybe we got a list like a join table of users and roles and put them together. Either way, that is admin could be a function or a related field. We don't really need to go over that. I feel like because it's relationships at that point. So normally with permissions, you might see something like, let me center this so it's easier to see for everybody. Normally you'd see like a relationship called maybe permissions. And like return this, oh, I already did that, belongs to many. And then that'd be like permission, class. We're not actually going to do the work of setting that up. But that makes sense, right? That's just a permissions relationship. basic layer-value relations. We're not going to do this because I don't feel like the factories and the scaffolding and all that. So what we're going to do instead, let's just create a maybe like an add permission function. We'll just give it a permission string. And we'll do something like this, permissions, array, if I can type, permission. Back up to the top of the screen. So we're just going to add to an array for a permission string. That way we can do this in a test environment. We'll just give it a permission string and the test will still pass. We don't have to comment stuff out everywhere. And then we should be good developers and declare that thing at the top of our class here. Right? We can make Minky unhappy and not type int it. So does this add permission function make sense? We're just adding to an array, right?
I wonder what that would go like if we were coworkers. Just be like, we're just gonna approve this PR that doesn't.
I think there would have to be like a dedicated like octagon in here.
Yeah.
Boxing gloves.
Oh yeah. The headgear or the shin guards.
As long as I get like a paintball gun.
Whoa.
And you're handcuffed to the
Bringing
octagon.
a baseball gun to a fist fight.
I don't
didn't
think
want to say like a real gun because that would just seem way too.
Yeah,
I don't
a
actually
little-
want to like hurt.
nowadays.
hurt
I don't
that.
think like making me like
Bullshitting.
getting me like up against a firing wall is anywhere fair.
No, it's not. It's just you practice jujitsu. And
I'm fat. What are you talking about? You cannot run me.
I had a coworker
Yeah,
who
that just made me look cool.
You could Conor McGregor me all day.
I
Just talk shit.
I had a coworker who, when he knew we were on a tight schedule and I had to approve his PRs quickly, he would use the old array syntax just to piss me off. The array with parentheses.
That's almost a little bit funny.
No, it is funny. I'm
Did you ever reject and say stop being a dick?
No, I felt too pedantic to hold it up just for that, even though I hated
I mean,
looking at
to
it.
be fair, the real answer to that is like set up PHPCS fixer or
Yes, that is true. That is
what's
true.
the other one is the same name or PHPCS. Whatever it's huh?
We use LCI.
Or that too. They have ways to make that not even a problem. So the fact that it even was a problem is kind of silly in itself. But I understand it's hard to get approval for that sometimes.
Yes, no, that's true. I could have done that.
But honestly, it's actually a recurring problem on my current team, but we haven't been able to put the time to like agree on a set of standards. But I keep nagging people about it. It will happen. It's been a year, but it will happen.
Standard, because using Laravel, PSR2.
Well, PSR2 will not cover the array. Actually, does it? It might. I don't think it does.
They just approved PSR 12, which
Yeah.
goes into a lot more stuff. I forget.
Yeah, I'm not a big. There's one rule I don't like. Otherwise, PSR12 is fine.
Yeah.
Um,
Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, getting back on this, we're going to go try to add permissions to a user here. I don't remember if I made a new test for this. Do you remember if I made a new test for this? Like, should I make a new test? We'll just make one. Make user permission test. So we'll create a user. This should be pretty repetitive by now. User, add permission. We'll call this Minky because Minky's cool. And we will
Totally never sarcastic.
we'll go to a route called Minky, and we'll make sure that I 403 for this one because he's not cool. And oh man, he's showing like your name's like misspelled or something, man. I'm sorry. So this is actually 404. Let's go to
Your,
our.
dictionary.
Minky CB turn Minky.
Kind of cool that name comes up golden.
I know. Gold star for the golden board.
Get out of here. So that's a way to force me to do it, huh? Play the ego. All right, so user permission test. Let's take off this Minky permission real quick, and we should 403 here because there is no permission. Oh, come on, I gotta stop doing this. All right, expected to 403 because we haven't actually done a permission check on this. So we can use our handy middleware if we want to. Can Minky. And now we get a 403, right? Let's go add another test. boy can Minky, because I'm cooler than him. Well, I'm gonna copy paste this.
That
'Cause
sounds
it's
wrong,
faster.
man.
Oh wow, you had to go there. Is cooler than Minky. There, and we'll add permission. And this actually still won't work. Oh man, I'm not in there either. So I need to make this a. So this is going to fail because we actually haven't added a way to check a permission yet, right? We're just looking at is admin. So let's go back to our before handler. And so I'm not an admin, right? So what if I want to say like if user has permission, and then we'll say the ability goes into here. Return true. And this should still fail, right? And then we need to write a has permission function. User have permission has permission. We'll use collections because they're a little bit faster.
How do you mean faster?
To type and work with. Yeah. Now I'm gonna go see what I. Oh, I also have to log my user in. We forgot to do that in our test. Okay, so that was kind of quick. So let's look back at what we did. Well, service provider. So we had this is admin check. But we know that I'm not an admin, so we added a has permission thing. So let's go ahead and comment this out just to see this fail again. Right? So we just need to add a little has permission function on the user model. And then we pass it the ability which comes from this callback. And then again, we're just going to check real easily if that's in the list of permissions that we have. So this is actually really no different than typing is like in array or something. But we could put some custom resolution in the contains or whatever. So does this make sense to everybody? Adam?
Yeah.
Okay. Robert?
Yeah, can you put this on GitHub later? I want to boost my SEO for my personal brand.
Yeah, sure. Sure. Yeah, I seriously will for you. I already have like meetup branches on there. So in this before handler is where we could write any sort of JSON check, like if a user's in a JSON file, right? We could have some sort of user ID to JSON mapper and wrap it in an if statement here. Again, you could also call out to an API somehow. But this runs on every single web request. And if you are an authenticated user on a web request, this will fire for everything. I think I misspoke about the key workers earlier. Since you don't have an authenticated user, the before will never fire because you don't have an authenticated user. So thankfully that actually wouldn't fire there. But any way you can decide, is this user an admin or a permission, you can just check inside of an array for a list of permissions. That makes sense for everybody? I think that's actually everything that I had. Oh, form request real quick. Let's do, has anybody actually used form request here? Okay. So there's one gotcha with them that you're probably aware of with the authorize function request. And we'll do foo request, I guess. No, I don't have a controller. Post request. So there's two functions in a form request. There's authorize and then there's rules. Rules would be where you put your validation rules and they follow the same validation rule syntax. Now this authorize defaults to false, which you might have known the first time you used one of these, you got a 403 when you just tried to get some form validation. Most people just say, screw that, I'm returning true here, which is all you need to do if you just want form validation. But some people, if they don't want to use the before hook, or if they don't want to write the one-line authorize thing, you still get that, and you don't want to put it in the constructor, all you have to do is put your resolution logic here, and it's hidden inside of a form request. So any sort of user can, user has permission, user is the same one that created the post, all of those things that we did earlier in the night can go here. That's all I really need. I don't think I actually need to go through all of the same functions, right? Do you have any questions? That pretty much wraps up the talk. Go ahead.
You may mention this, but on you said there's a gate after as well.
Yeah.
And does that gate after ever get called if the before comes back with true or false?
if anything before, I'm trying to word this cleverly, maybe I shouldn't. Anything that returns a Boolean, nothing after that happens in terms of the gates.
So if you were using that to do something that wasn't necessarily authentication, but to like log something, it would not get executed because if you're trying
Why would you use a gate to log something?
I don't know. I can't figure out why it would even exist.
I would disagree. I would need a really good reason if I were reviewing that PR for
Yeah.
that.
I just can't figure out why there is what the point of the after would be other than that.
So I think it depends on what database call you want to happen first, maybe.
Yeah.
Like maybe checking a list of permissions might be more taxing on your database or whatever your cache server is than maybe
I've seen-
looking at the model user, like the model
Yeah.
user ID and like the user ID for the logged in user. Either way, you're going to have to end up doing more than one database check. And the idea of like doing like a short circuiting thing in a if statement means like if you already have some state because you've already pulled a user, if you're looking at a database column on the user, you can put that first in the if statement because that will happen first. I'll be like, oh, since that's true, I don't need to check the rest of the conditions, right? If it's ORs anyway, right? Same thing with before. If you put return is or if is admin return true, then you don't have to query the post user anymore. Like you're saving one database call. I think I prefer using before instead of after because in order for after to happen, the defined gate action, all of the policy actions, everything has to be wrapped in an if statement so that you return null. Now, null, if everything returns null, that's still unauthorized, right? You have to have a truthy return to be authorized for a thing. But in the effort of not writing a bunch of if statements, I'd like to lean on before if possible. I don't know of a reason I would. There actually is one use case for after. We looked this up. That's right. Frank Demers, whatever, Spotty's guy. You know who I'm talking about? I think Belgium maybe. So they actually had if I'm an admin, I can do anything like in their before hooks, kind of like what we had, except I think that like the function like is super admin or something. They had a rule in their role that said something to the effect of if it's before the review start time, or if a regular user has already reviewed this, I don't want you to be able to review it again. To me, that sounds like validation logic, not authorization logic.
Yeah.
Arguable, but they put it in a policy. If you put if is superadmin return true inside your before function, you're going to beat that policy, right? So they moved that to after, and they just made sure to only return true if the condition is.
So it sounds like what you really want, the only thing I ever use after is if you want to make sure that the policies are
running first. Yeah. That's the only. I don't even like. Still, to me, I wouldn't use that case. I would put that in validation logic personally, but that is a nice because like you'd have to put that in your controller on your own. Because otherwise, validation logic has to happen. I guess it could be in the form request. But.
Yeah, I think if you're using all three, you've probably done something wrong somewhere.
Like if you're using before the policy and the after,
Yeah.
or before the gate action and the after.
Before policy and after. You
Yeah.
probably need to, take a look at how you're.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Again, I would lean on before if possible, or I would only lean on one of the two of them. If you're using all three, that's got to be weird. Because then you're wrapping everything in if statements except the after. Do we have any other questions? Bill? Andre? Tarek?
No.
Really? Did I actually answer everything you had?
Made me feel a lot more comfortable about
Okay.
permissions and whatnot. I feel pretty happy with policies for most of the things I need, and Menke's question kind of helped me out a little bit. The whole gauge your policies, what do you use, and I like how you explained that gauge are just kind of for like things that aren't related to a model, like the admin page example you kind of gave. So I feel pretty confident to move forward.
Cool.
Mm-hmm.
The question that Glenn actually expected you to ask is how does this work with APIs?
Mm-hmm.
If you remember from our API SPI talk, if you use any sort of built-in API authentication driver, which there are a couple, there's like token, basic, the JWT if you use Passport.
Mm-hmm.
Use any of the built-in, they're actually called auth guards. So you can also write a custom guard if you want. Just make sure you set that in your authentication config/auth maybe. We can find that later. As long as you're using a Laravel aware guard driver that will pass that user in through their request. So you can totally write a custom guard if you want to resolve the user through some means through your API. But let's be honest, if you're doing something other than using JWT or one of the built-in auth mechanisms, you're probably doing something a little wonky. Maybe take a look at it again. But you can always, again, write a custom guard and tell it how to resolve a user, which then all of this stuff still just magically works.
Do
That's the
like
important part.
gates and policies don't work if you use API API endpoints in
No,
Laravel?
no, they do.
Oh.
It's just that if you have your own authentication logic that's not using the built-in authentication stuff, then you're bypassing all of this auth stuff, right? Which means like the guards, like the gate access thing won't work because it's looking for the currently logged in user. And if you're bypassing the guard, that means every controller function you write is going to be having its own, do I have a logged in user here?
And I've
Or some sort of middleware.
I've seen shoddily written APIs where people did exactly that. So like, don't do that.
Okay.
Like the simple solution is if you have a middleware where you're doing your own authentication stuff and you're not tying it into the built-in Laravel authentication stuff, you're making your life harder because that makes testing harder. That makes other people using your API harder because that means you're making them authenticate in a different way than what's normal. If you tell them how to authenticate with a bearer token, Laravel has that. Passport has that. If you're telling them to use HTTP basic auth, Laravel has that. So look at what API drivers Laravel comes with out of the box. They do not have a JWT driver out of the box. That's what you need Passport for, and that gives you a JWT driver. If you don't have any, if you still have something more custom that you really want to use, just write your own API guard for it, or auth guard for the API, and then use that in your config. It's so in this config auth, you have a guards web and you have guards API. So you just have to tell it what driver, provider, and hash. You can just write your own driver and provider. That's all you have to do. Yeah. And then this Laravel becomes aware of your authentication mechanism, and everything we just talked about still just works out of the box.
There is one gotcha. When you do request user,
Mhm.
it pulls from the default guard only.
Are you sure?
I've tested it, at least in Lumen it does.
I was just looking at this weekend when I wrote this too. What is that?
I was banging my head against the wall for a couple hours on that one.
Request guard.
So you could use the auth facade instead to get the user.
No, that's still
How do I find
pulls
this?
from you don't have the correct guard. User stored in the guard.
So okay. Oh, okay.
This get provider. Are you sure you just didn't change that in the config? If you don't change it in the config, you're absolutely right.
I have a custom config, and there's the default JWT, then I have two other guards, and I needed to pull from one of the other guards to get the correct user.
Okay, let's go over that later. What version of Laravel first?
It's Lumen, and it's 5.7.
If it's Lumen, I'm not even going to argue for it.
Okay.
You lost interest. Lumen is
They're close, but they're not.
no, they're not. They're not even. No, it's a redheaded stepchild now to Taylor. Taylor doesn't care about it.
Really?
I don't know if he's actually on record saying that, but it's very clear in his actions. So, like the testing stuff is still like same as Laravel 5.2. There's a lot of testing stuff I wanted when I played with Lumen about a year ago. Was that about a year ago, Glenn? The checklist app. We're going to use Lumen to build a stupid little thing, and I was like, never mind. I was going to go use Symfony 4, said never mind, and went back to Laravel. Any other questions? I'm going to go ahead and stop the stream, and if we have more questions.